Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen Kloester, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's virtual author event with Nick Richardson this evening. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Maar original owners of the lands on which our library services operate. We pay respect to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders, past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. It's great to have everyone here. It looks like we've got around 60 people joining us tonight, which is fantastic. Just to remind everyone who's joined in, you can participate tonight by clicking on the Q&A button and typing in your question or your comment. You might need, if you have an iPad or an iPhone, you need to touch the screen to see the Q&A and the chat functions if you want to join in tonight. We love people to join in, and we will have 3 short polls tonight as part of the webinar, and any questions you want to answer we'll get Nick to answer at the end of the evening. So I have great pleasure tonight in introducing author Nick Richardson to debunk one of the hardiest clichés in Australian history, that the 1950s were a dull decade. Nick Richardson is an author, academic and journalist who has written for a range of publications in England and Australia. He has a PhD in history from the University of Melbourne and is adjunct professor of journalism at La Trobe University. Welcome, Nick.
Welcome, Jen. Thank you very much for having me, and welcome to everyone who's joined in. Thanks for coming along.
And Nick, thank you for your terrific book, 1956.
Thank you.
Probably backwards, but the year Australia welcomed the world. Although it's actually really a book that covers quite an extensive part of the 1950s in Australia. And what a kind of compelling historical account it is, Nick. So congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's actually got so many fascinating stories that cross political, cultural and social areas. But what I found really interesting was this way of drawing all those stories together using the 1956 Olympics. And I just wondered, where did your interest in the Olympics and this idea for the book come from?
Well, it started in a very kind of strange way. When I was a working journalist, I was doing some preparation for the coverage of the 2012 Olympics. And during the course of that, you inevitably look backwards, and, you're looking at records and innovations and, precedent and all that kind of stuff. And during the course of that, it struck me that there had been so many things that occurred in Melbourne's Olympic year of 1956 that weren't just about the Olympics. And in fact, the Olympics towards the end of the year, in some ways became a kind of culmination of all those things that had been percolating away for some years in some instances, and in other ways that sort of lightning rods for deeper issues. So it kind of struck me at that point that the Olympics became, in a sense, a kind of symbol of all those other things that had been going on. And Melbourne happened to find itself at the centre of those at that particular time.
Well, that was actually a really fascinating story, as well as the bid for the Olympics, the men in particular involved, Sir Frank Beaurepaire among others, men of quite large egos, I think you might say.
I think you would.
But being the sort of post-war era, because we won the bid, I think, 1949.
Yes, that's right.
It was only 4 years after the end of World War II. And of course, Australia had issues with Japan because we had so many returned soldiers. And I think this idea, we had the White Australia policy, racism was still an issue. Can you talk to us about that?
One of the really interesting things that I discovered during the course of the researching of the book was that the critical vote that guaranteed Melbourne the Games, and bear in mind, Melbourne only won the bid from Buenos Aires in 1949 by 1 vote, and it remains the narrowest vote in Olympic history. And that one vote, as it turned out, belonged to an elderly and unwell Japanese IOC delegate. And the fact that Japan in 1949 had supported Australia's bid was something of a well-kept secret. There was very little discussion about it. There was very little public airing of it. But there was a very vigorous and robust discussion in the papers about Japanese athletes coming to Melbourne for the Games in 1956. And there was some very trenchant opposition, especially from the military and veterans organisations, that the Japanese might well be coming to Australia in 7 years hence. So there was a very contested and difficult time around that kind of acceptance that Melbourne would become the host for people who had only, in such recent memories, been the national enemy.
Absolutely. You talk about the Games as sort of classic soft diplomacy. Do you know?
Yeah, and they were in its way, because it enabled a lot of the tensions and difficulties between nations to be ameliorated in many ways. But they weren't all resolved. And one of the interesting things, and one of the equally less discussed elements about the 56 Olympics, was that it was the first Games where nations boycotted it. And so there were 5 nations that didn't turn up, and central to that was the Russian invasion in Hungary just months before the Games came around, and China, because Formosa or Taiwan had been accepted into the Games, China didn't come either. So there was no doubting that the Cold War tensions were very prevalent in the final iteration of the Games.
That was something else that really struck me too, was this Masaji Tabata, the Japanese Olympic Society secretary, who actually said that Australia was as much a part of Asia as is Indonesia. Do you think that's the first time that someone had actually talked about Australia as being part of Asia? I mean, predating Keating and other, later politicians? It's
a really interesting point, Jen, and I think it struck quite a significant chord. There was obviously a lot of resistance to it, but in practical terms, it was an absolutely accurate depiction of what was going to happen in the Games themselves. This was a Games, because it was in the Southern Hemisphere, would actually have a higher proportion of Asian participation than any other Games up until then. But the difficulties Australia had in reconciling itself to that was, of course, as I point out in the book, was up until 4 months before the Games, they still hadn't found any chefs from anywhere around the world who could go into the Olympic Village and cook appropriate food for the Asian athletes.
Yeah. That was one of the things that really I found so interesting. Your book in many ways reads almost like a sort of novel, almost like a detective novel. You're kind of pulling all these amazing disparate strands together, the Suez crisis, Menzies' leadership or otherwise, the Ukrainian defector, Marlene Matthews, a sprinter who I'd never heard of, who competed with Betty Cuthbert and Shirley Strickland, whose names most Australians know, the inception of television. There are so many sort of threads that get pulled together, and yet through the book, it's as if we're kind of heading towards, will the Olympics come off? What's going to happen? There are all these obstacles that come in the way, and I found real echoes of from the 1956 Olympics to the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. There was sort of quite a few things in common. And actually, this discussion of the Olympics, we might actually pull up our first poll.
Yes.
Perhaps the poll about the Olympics, if we can do that.
Yes, let's do that.
Which is the one that says, I think, did you go to the Olympics? Yeah, were you at the 1956 Olympics? So we'll let people have a look at that. What do you think Australia's sort of take on the Olympics was at this time? From 49, we win the Games, but what did Australians by and large think about the Olympics?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? I think the difference, there was a difference between what Melbourne thought about it and what the rest of Australia thought about it. For Melbourne, it was a far more compelling presence. They had to get organised, they had to deal with it, they had to get a sense of this enormous international event. Whereas I think the rest of Australia thought, no, well, you know, that's Melbourne can look after that and we'll turn up when the party starts. So, and, you know, a couple of people I spoke to for the book, most relevantly, Bruce Howard, who was a young photographer at the Melbourne Herald at the time, he said that there was a very strong sense that Melbourne might well have bitten off more than they could chew. And I think that that was quite a common response. And with every impediment that rolled through the years, it looked increasingly likely that Melbourne would have to mount some kind of superhuman effort to get the job done. And they did. They did.
Yeah, they did. Do you think this was a kind of springboard into a broader thinking, different kind of Melbourne, if not Australia?
Yeah, it was. And in a sense, that's one of the themes of the book itself, is that the kind of the social forces and the cultural forces that this started to set fire to, in a way, became enduring and took root across the country. I mean, one of the really interesting things, and I'm not the first person to make this point, but one of the interesting things is harking back to that international cuisine that came to Australia as a consequence of the Games. There are a number of those chefs who did finish up in Melbourne, who in the aftermath of the Games either set up restaurants in Melbourne or moved to Sydney and set up restaurants. And there was this, an acknowledgement that here was another way to cook, another way to eat, and another way to socialise. And that was integral to the cultural shift generated by the Games.
So the Olympics obviously brought quite some significant cultural changing benefits, I think you could say. So according to our poll, 16% of our attendees, our guests, went to the Olympics. So that's exciting. 84% did not. So that'll make the book even more interesting for them. Because there's so much in here to really understand about Australia. I think that's something else that really struck me. Things that I knew a bit about, but didn't really understand the significance of. And I was fascinated. Of course, Barry Humphries begins.
Yeah.
Dame Edna at this time. Yeah, which was fascinating. But there was also, is this where the term cultural cringe begins?
The cultural cringe idea, I think, was launched by A.A. Phillips in 1950, but it kind of, in a sense, came into vogue in the mid-50s because of this very interesting period of activity that at one level there was Dame Edna, she was just Mrs. Everidge at that stage from Moonee Ponds, who does her initial sketch is actually about being an Olympic hostess. But within months after that comes Summer of the 17th Doll.
Yeah.
And later in 1956, there is Douglas Stewart's Ned Kelly, which is a dramatisation of Stewart's epic poem about Ned Kelly. So there is a lot going on. And then there's this, what's often forgotten about is an Olympic arts festival, which occurs in the same period as the Olympic Games. And that in itself is a strange hybrid activity, which seems to draw no great crowd and seems to be almost an exercise in Australians avoiding talking about their culture rather than celebrating it.
Well, that really, really struck me, that they got sort of £500 as a budget to run some kind of an arts festival. And then when it was launched by Sir Dallas Brooks, he gave this just horrendous speech. Where he says, you described, I think, Sir Dallas Brooks had metaphorically put the nation's writers, artists, architects and musicians into a collective act of self-abnegation. And no one challenged his view of the cultural offering, but he seemed to just constantly apologise at the launch. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, do you think one of the questions that sort of arose out of your account of the literary festival and the poor budget for that, and what was, you know, writers were not included, books were not included, artists were, apparently I think only men from the list you gave. Is this the beginning of when sport really overtakes the arts in Australia?
Well, to be fair, it actually wasn't a fair fight to begin with. In this instance, there was no real commitment to the arts, and in fact, it was a bit of a hangover from previous Olympics. And the International Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage, an American, had actually wanted to change this format and drove Melbourne to actually create this festival, which Melbourne was kind of, I don't think, had the appetite for. It certainly didn't have the structure to deliver, and it certainly didn't have the commitment to it either. So I think what happened is that it just, to take your point, I think that the huge gap between audiences who were flocking to the MCG and Lake Wendouree and all the other Olympic facilities in and around Victoria were no match for the fairly pedestrian queues that were cycling through the Arts Festival.
Makes sense, absolutely. So the Summer of the 17th Doll is sort of the first really genuinely Australian play, do you think? I mean, I know we'd had musicals, but certainly it's very Australian in tone, and it actually did really well.
It did remarkably well. But the thing that I didn't realise about it until I started researching this book was, in fact, how Australian it had to be in its staging. Because up until that point, so many of Australian stage productions were highly derivative. They had come from Britain. They were either acted by people like Dame Sybil Thornton, like Ralph Richardson, Laurence Olivier, you know, the whole gamut of that Shakespearean actor with the correct pronunciation. And a lot of Australian actors who supported those particular roles did so with adopted English accents. So what happened when Doll arrived was that the director, John Sumner, who in fact was an Englishman, had to encourage the Australian actors to speak in the local language. They had to sound more Australian. He actually coached them to do it. And that struck me as being a remarkable turnaround, and it only amplifies, to my thinking, the importance of the doll as a cultural touch point at this particular time.
But it's also paradoxical because it talks about self-assertion was in the air in relation to the doll. And yet at the same time, we are very much, certainly politically, a part of the empire, the British Empire.
Yeah.
And so, because of course we have the Suez crisis, where Menzies happens to be overseas in England, and can you explain this? Why did they urge Menzies to be the person to go and to try and negotiate with NASA? I mean, I found that quite extraordinary when he was so obviously not a diplomat in that way. I would have thought Casey, who had actual experience in the Middle East, was more.
Well, and Casey was in fact briefing Menzies about how to deal with it, but Menzies actually wasn't particularly interested in hearing that, or indeed had any great time for Casey's broader view about how to deal with it. Casey would, of course, been the logical choice, but I think in many ways there was, I think Menzies was a bit of a dupe in this sense to Anthony Eden as the British UK, and to a lesser extent maybe the US as well, but certainly Menzies was caught in doing Eden's business, bidding, I should say. And, you know, the reality was that there was, on any objective reading, there was probably no way that anyone could have brokered a deal with NASA given the circumstances. So, to be fair to Menzies, he was probably on a hiding to nothing, to use an Australianism.
But he was also fairly, he was very inclined to support the British in almost anything they wanted.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
when you think about Maralinga and Montebello Island and the nuclear bomb tests that were done in the outback, I just found that quite extraordinary reading about that, and the fact that they didn't do any really proper oversight of who was in the area, you know, whether there were any Indigenous people, whether they might be affected. There was sort of none of that. And it really, I think, to a modern sensibility, it just even 60 years on, 70 years, is quite shocking.
Well, it is. And I think, you know, in these instances, when you're writing, you look for patterns of behaviour, and it's not hard to find a pattern of behaviour in the way that Menzies dealt with all of this, and to think back to those nuclear tests when the UK Prime Minister Clem Attlee asks him in 1950 whether Australia would be happy to host the testing of these nuclear devices. Menzies readily agrees without even consulting with Cabinet. So 6 years later, when Maralinga comes around, and there is this massive hinterland that is actually only two people, two white men, to try to find where the Indigenous communities are, where they're moving to, and where they're coming from, as a means of trying to work out whether they're going to be safe from the nuclear explosions. It's breathtaking.
Yeah, I found it unbelievable. But I suppose within the context of the time, I mean, there's so many things that resonate now, but were very much of the 50s. I mean, there's so much to talk about. Tell us a bit about the rise of television.
Well, the rise of television. Well, maybe we should actually put up our second poll now about what people remember of the 1950s, because this is a period when I think the idea of TV kind of dominated what our entertainment options looked like. But as true as that was, there were lots of other entertainments going on. And one of the really interesting ones of all of those was, of course, Rock Around the Clock, the movie, which came to Australia in 1956 and caused a stir throughout the country, where reckless teenagers were becoming hostages to that, to the rock music. And in fact, there were arrests outside cinemas in George Street, Sydney, in the aftermath of the movie, because
for offensive and indecent behaviour.
Because
they were dancing in the street after seeing the movie. You're just like, wow. I actually had to get onto YouTube and look up and watch Rock Around the Clock and remind myself of that fabulous dancing, which now is just basically swing. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Oh, the poll results come up. We have 71% remember the arrival of television.
There you are.
Maralinga is 5%, the Suez Crisis 19%, and the Petrov affair 5%. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it is.
The whole television thing, I hadn't realised there'd been a royal commission in
Yes.
television.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to believe.
There need to be a nation of royal commissions, Nick.
Yeah, well, I think it was very much an opportunity here again for Menzies to buy himself a little time. Menzies wasn't a huge fan of TV, and there is, I think, quite strong speculation that one of the reasons he didn't like it was an early appearance on a US current affairs program, where beforehand he was asked what questions he would not like to have to deal with when he was on camera, and he gave quite a list, and then was dismayed to find out they were the only questions he was asked when the cameras were rolling. So I think he kind of set up a fairly jaundiced view about TV from then on.
Except it didn't stop him having a TV in his Bentley. Was it in his Bentley?
Yes, when he was in London, the car he was allowed to have while he was in England contained a television, which unfortunately for him didn't at a particular time have coverage of the Test cricket, of which he was, of course, a devotee, but an episode of Robin Hood, I seem to remember.
I just think that's fascinating. So as we sort of gallop along towards the Olympics, and we're dealing with the Russian invasion of Hungary, the defection of that young woman, Nina Peranyuk, who was a Ukrainian. I thought that was really interesting. And she managed to evade capture or detection for quite some time, and eventually the ship she'd come off left without her. That's a really interesting story, and do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Nina was a woman from a very harsh upbringing in a small town near Odessa in the Ukraine, and she had struggled for some years to leave her hardship behind, and managed to get a job as a stewardess on a ship called the Gruzia, which was a Russian ship that was bringing the Russian Olympic team to Australia. And when she got the job, she felt that this would, wherever the ship took her, would be the opportunity for her to leave Russia and all of the misery behind her. Anyway, it became a very difficult set of circumstances for her, because at the height of the Cold War, the Russian welcome in Australia was not particularly full of sweetness and light. There were a lot of Ukrainians at Port Melbourne who were protesting against it and against the Russians' presence. But what the Russians did do was that they, several days, they gave their crew members an opportunity to tour Melbourne. And during one of these tours, which included a spell at Melbourne Zoo, Nina stole away and managed to get a lift away from the zoo, and finished up finding a safe house, as it turned out, near Broadmeadows.
Extraordinary. How aware, I mean, what effect do you think, I mean, the Cold War obviously had an enormous effect on Australia, but how much of understanding was there of defection and the kind of things that were really going on in Eastern Europe at the time in Australia, do you think?
Yeah, look, I don't think there was a lot. I think the Petrov affair had kind of woke Australia up to the idea that these things could occur on our doorstep, and I think that was a very sobering moment for a lot of Australians. But by 1956, there was our spies, ASIO, were very well prepared for what they thought might happen, and they fully expected that there would be defections from the games, and they were very careful about how they the protocols they put in place to handle that. And Nina in particular was kept at very arm's length. She wrote to Menzies pleading with him for asylum, but they refused to do anything with it on the premise that she might have been being put up to it by those who were trying to foment some level of discord around the games.
It certainly seemed to be not a controversial games in that way. The politics didn't seem to, there were plenty of politics going on in Australia at the time, a lot of different issues and controversies, but it didn't seem to infiltrate the games themselves. I mean, I wasn't alive, but my sense of the games was it was a very sort of happy games, and the things we remember or know about were things like Shirley Strickland and Betty Cuthbert and Ron Clark lighting the cauldron and these sort of extraordinary things. And the relay, the torch relay that I think most people who watch the Olympics now just sort of take for granted as this kind of amazing thing, getting to Australia, getting the torch to Australia and then getting it from Cairns to Melbourne was an extraordinary adventure.
Look, I think we should be forever grateful to a guy called Marcus Marsden, who took on the role. He was an academic at University of Melbourne. He was an amateur footballer. He spent a lot of his weekends out in the bush. He was a very handy, practical man. But he was given the job of coordinating the torch relay. Had never done anything like this before. And he started out with, and some of the people who are watching tonight will remember those fold-up mobile maps that you'd get from the service station. They were his first resource in plotting where he would take the torch from Cairns through to Melbourne. And it was, when you think about it, it was an extraordinary triumph of logistics, really.
And interesting that women were not allowed to carry the torch in the torch relay.
No, which was kind of, and you know,
Very
bizarre.
strange.
Bizarre because they did a little trial beforehand, and women were involved,
Yeah,
but in the real one, they weren't.
they were quite extraordinary. But we did have an Indigenous man,
Yeah,
and there's a wonderful photo in your book. I'm just
yeah.
trying to find it,
Anthony,
of him.
Anthony Mark, his name was.
Yes, and it's here, right here. Let me
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
Right
So,
there.
yeah,
Yeah, fabulous photograph of him.
yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it? And he worked in a mission in the northern far north Queensland, and was flown down to Cairns to run the second leg of the relay.
Incredible. So your book tracks the sort of, it opens in summer of 1955-56 and then tracks through the season, which I thought was a really interesting way to do it, and pulling all these various strands together, and then bit by bit we kind of get that sense of anticipation, excitement. We've had a message from Gary Mann, who says his father was an ABC commentator for the 1956 Olympics.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So
I wonder if Gary's got some audio of his dad calling some of the games.
Well, that would be amazing because television was so new, we only had limited coverage of the games.
That's right.
I'm just going to remind the audience, please, if you'd like to send through some questions, feel free. You just have to type them in, and I'm sure Nick would love to answer some questions. But yes, so we who are so used to coverage of everything now, tell us a bit about the Olympic coverage, the television coverage.
Well, it was very limited because there were actually, at that stage, none of the TV stations really had the resources or the wherewithal to actually cover the games in full. And there was an arrangement that they could really only cover the MCG, the main stadium, if it was full. So they managed to get some footage. But one of the interesting examples I found of a bit of resourcefulness was an old journo who had been a Royal Commissioner on television and was running GTV9 in it before it formally launched. He actually managed to get cameras in below the waterline at the Olympic pool and managed to get footage of the famous Russian-Hungarian water polo match.
The bloodbath.
The blood in the water game, yeah, which was kind of pretty remarkable, I think. And having said that, I'm not sure where that footage is. So I'd very much like to see it.
Is there much? I mean, I've seen is it the women's relay?
Yes.
With Shirley Strickland and Betty Cuffin. Tell us about Marlene Matthews.
So Marlene, in fact, was probably leading into those games. She was the women's sprint favourite. She had had good form. She'd done particularly well at Commonwealth Games. She was young. She was fast, and on the times that she'd recorded, she was, if not Cuthbert's match, she was certainly her superior on her previous track record. What happened was, as Marlene explains it, that she and Betty both made the 100-metre final. And Marlene says, she said, I used to be a terrible starter, and she actually started really badly. And before she knew it, half the race was over and she was, having to make up a huge amount of ground. So she did a great job to get the bronze, and then behind Betty, who won the gold, and then Betty won the gold in the 200, and Marlene was the bronze medal winner in the 200 as well. On the face of it, so she is the third fastest woman in the world.
Yeah.
On the face of it, a walk-up start for the women's 4x100 metre relay to be held at the final day of competition of the Games, and then is not selected.
Yeah.
And there is still no agreement about why she missed out. There was some speculation that she wasn't great running the bends, but she didn't need to run the bends because she could have run 2 of the straight legs. They suggesting that she might not have been a great changer of the baton, but there'd been no evidence of that. There was some suggestion that as a New South Welsh person, she might have altered the balance of the team. Anyway, it was sadly a terrible moment for her, and the Australian women 4x100 won the gold, and she was in the stands in tears because...
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah, very tough.
Yeah.
That's sport, I suppose. Now we have a question relating to the Olympics from Philip. Did Australia's dominance in the pool cause disruption in the Olympic Committee?
Oh, thanks for your question, Philip. I'm not sure about that. Certainly, that suggests that Philip might have had some inside information about that. I can't say definitively about that. Certainly, our performance in the pool became a real benchmark for the Olympics to come. But I also think it created that, it burnished that legend of Australia's swimming excellence, which we still see today.
How much inspiration did the Olympics give to Australians, do you think, the 56 Olympics?
In a general sense, or in a sporting?
Sporting, or both, really.
Yeah. Look, I think they were. From a sporting sense, it slotted in very nicely into the narrative that we believed that we were sporting a nation of great sports people. That was kind of took a bit of a dent 4 years later in Rome, when our Olympic performance didn't quite measure up anywhere near the stellar performance of Melbourne. But I think in a general sense, I think the inspiration across the nation was, and particularly in Melbourne, was very powerful. And I think one of the things that made it so was the closing ceremony, which...
Oh yes, tell us that wonderful story.
So there was a 17-year-old boy called John Ian Wing, who had towards the end of the games wrote to the head of the Australian Olympic Committee and suggested that the closing ceremony, which would normally have been done in a very regimented way, very much like the opening ceremony, that the nations marched in their national groups and waved and did all of that. He suggested that they mingle, that all the athletes from all the nations mingled and basically, expressed their gratitude to the crowd by very much a free form celebration. And remarkably, within 2 days of this letter being received by the Australian Olympic Committee, they made it happen. And so much of the commentary after the games referred to what a wonderful innovation it had been, and in fact, underlined that Melbourne was indeed the happy games.
Absolutely, it was a remarkable letter. He was just a young man, really. Was he 17? Grandson of a Chinese migrant who'd come out to the goldfields. And he says on page 267 of your excellent book,
Good.
The march I have in mind is different than the one during the opening ceremony. It will make these games even greater. During the march, there will only be one nation. How very prescient of him as well.
Oh, wow. It's a wonderful idea. And I think, you have to give credit to the organisers who saw the power of it and allowed it to happen.
Absolutely. The gentleman whose father was a journalist at the Olympics, Gary, has written in to say his father was a print journalist and former WA swimming champion.
Oh, wow.
He introduced me to Dawn Fraser and John Conrad, and they went to a show during the Olympics where Frankie Lane was the entertainment.
Wow.
And his father later became the marketing manager at Macquarie Broadcasting, and he thoroughly enjoyed the book.
Oh, good. Lovely. Thank you very much.
It was very, very good. It's a very enjoyable book, I must say. So I just also So we've got the Olympics and we've got all these extraordinary events happening, one of which was the reception of Patrick White's novel, Tree of Man.
Mm.
Now, I found this really, really interesting. The very disparate responses to this book from international reviewers as opposed to the Australian reviewers. Can you tell us about that, please?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? So the Tree of Man is wonderfully received by the New York Times Review of Books. You know, there is clearly a sense that this is a novel of some stature by a writer of quite significant ability. In Australia, it's reviewed by someone who becomes quite a famous poet, and indeed, still at this stage in the mid-1950s, is a considerable literary critic, Alec Hope, A.D. Hope, and he reviews it, and it is a stinging review, a devastating critique in many ways, which, to give A.D. Hope his due, years later, I think he felt somewhat chastened by the effect it had on Patrick White. But this was a very completely contrary to the international reception for the novel. And then there was another review in The Age which basically suggested that if this was the great Australian novel, then, you know, why were we bothering? So it was kind of obviously, you know, we now know that White would in latter years become the only Australian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. So you have to wonder that this kind of almost angry response was quite extraordinary, and it kind of contributed, I think, to White's fairly jaundiced view about critics, and especially those in his home country.
I can't help but think that this idea of cultural cringe bleeds into this response. There's this sort of sense of what it meant to be Australian,
yes,
you know, which didn't marry with what White was writing at the time, I think.
There's an interesting phrase that I kept coming up against, and it was kind of challenging to find ways to deal with it. And this is this idea of the Australian way of life. And what was the Australian way of life in 1956, and how different was it then to what had preceded it? And when we're reading the book now, how different does it feel to the Australian way of life in 2020?
Well, that's a really interesting thing, because early on in the book you make the point that there was nothing to do on weekends.
Yes.
And, you know, you went to nothing to do on a Sunday afternoon. You know, there was sort of the football on the Saturday and church on the Sunday. I can't help but observe that in 2020, right now, nothing's changed.
No, nothing's changed. No.
Nothing to do on weekends. No.
Weekends not much different to Monday to Friday.
Indeed, it was a genuine irony. But there was this very distinct sort of sense of what it meant, I think, you know, how we lived, still very much influenced by Britain and our supposed place in the empire. And perhaps people like White were unsettling or, you know, exploding those ideas and trying to make us think about ourselves differently. And this was an unwelcome.
Look, I think that's exactly right. And I think the literary part of the arts festival, there was no novelist who'd been published after 1940 in all of that. So the idea of how modern Australia or old Australia was being portrayed by contemporary Australian novelists, there was very little appreciation of what that looked like and what value it had, which I think is unfortunate.
Well, we've got our third poll. If people would like to have a go at that. What do you remember of home life in the 1950s? So I will people have a bit of a think about that. I don't remember anything.
No, I don't either. But I think one of the things that was increasingly common in the 1950s was cars became a affordable they became not only the means of getting to and from work, but also the family recreation, the Sunday drive. It also meant that because more people could afford cars, that the suburbs became places to live, and so the whole kind of quarter-acre block, the larger houses, the larger backyards, all of those sorts of things became far more commonplace. And of course, when you're in a house, Sunday drives.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
So more than half the respondents remember Sunday drives.
Yeah.
Wow. So you're really on the ball. And the other thing that they were certainly doing in New South Wales was playing the pokies.
Yes, and you see, this is one of and until I started researching the book, I had no idea about this, but
I had none.
1956, in July, the New South Wales government became only the second jurisdiction outside of Las Vegas to legalise poker machines, which, is a kind of extraordinary thought now. But of course, the other thing, which we kind of all have an implicit understanding of, is that in their early days in particular, there were a number of less than, some shady characters who became involved.
Less than savoury. Well, there was quite a rise in crime in New South Wales as a result of the pokies.
Yeah,
that's what I understood from the book. So many strands that you managed to sort of pull together in this really remarkable way. That then led us to the Olympics. Along the way, we had to get us to the Olympics. One of the really important figures was this Avery Brundage, the IOC. He was an American, and quite a character by your account. So can you tell us about Avery Brundage and his role?
Well, he was also known as Slavery Umbridge, and there are all manner of nicknames for him because he was a belligerent and bellicose, and he was a Chicago property developer who had been an Olympian, but he was wealthy, very wealthy in his own right, but he had this kind of very deep conviction that amateurism and the Olympic spirit needed to be maintained at all costs. And he was particularly indignant about the way that Melbourne went about its preparations, and at various occasions was threatened to take the games off Melbourne, and at one point claimed to have a telegram in his pocket from another city in the US who would be happy to step into the breach because Melbourne clearly wasn't up to it.
There were real moments when, in your discussions of the Olympics and all the different things that were happening, that couldn't help but make me think of John Clark and Brian for the Games. And there was so much that was sort of parallel with the Sydney Olympics, and you're thinking really 44 years later, and a lot of things haven't changed. And this whole, will we be ready in time? And all of the bureaucratic stumblings, one of which just kind of was amazing. In the Olympic Village, which was built in Heidelberg, they named all the street names after World War II battles.
Yes.
Right?
Well, there are a couple in particular, and it took a visit by a diligent journalist who had been in the Korean War, covered the Korean War from the Herald and Weekly Times, who spotted these street names and alerted the Olympic authorities that it might not be particularly politic for German athletes or Japanese athletes to find Alamein Street as their residential address for the course of the Games.
How many athletes actually came from overseas? Do you have a rough idea?
Well, there were 3,500 athletes all up. It wasn't the biggest Games, but there was 67 countries that came here. So it was, Games in those days were still, teams were smaller, inevitably, but it was still a very fine representation. And in fact, if memory serves, it was a couple more countries than the 52 Games in Helsinki.
And also, how did because they would have had to come mostly by ship, surely, not because planes were still you know, evolving, I
Mm.
think it's fair to say, which was a pretty long journey from Europe.
Yeah, it was. And this was one of the, considered one of the big impediments for Melbourne, or indeed Buenos Aires, hosting the Games back in 1949. And because in those days, even though the Games were only going to be 7 years in advance, there was still this view that air travel to the Southern Hemisphere was, well, it would take about 3 days effectively by the time you allowed for the stopovers and all of that. So pretty much everyone arrived by ship.
Well, the equestrian event was actually still held in Sweden, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And the reason being that the Australian government wouldn't relax its quarantine rules to allow horses into the country. So, and here again, this was another reason for Brundage to beat Australia over the head, saying this has never happened before. My IOC delegates are agitated and annoyed that it's come to this, and on it went, really.
And was the village, you know, did it meet the sort of international standard, the village in Heidelberg? I mean, we brought in all these chefs, and
in the end, it did. I think it was Marlene Matthews recounts how little, you know, for the Australians in particular, because competition was episodic and all of that. They didn't really necessarily know their teammates. Unlike swim teams these days or athletic teams these days, they weren't constantly moving around together or whatever. So even for the locals, it was difficult for them to kind of feel that they could, fraternise. And of course, the men and the women were in separate areas. And of course, the women's rooms had ironing boards and irons, but the men's didn't.
And a sewing machine.
And a sewing machine. That's
I
right.
was just really quite jaw-dropping, really. An ironing board, a washing machine, and a sewing machine in the women's quarters. What did the men have as an equivalent? I don't know.
Well, you can't iron tracks.
Of all the things to provide an athlete with.
Yes.
But, I guess it was a very gendered world then, far more than hopefully it is now. But anyway,
fair enough.
So many interesting things. We should probably begin to wind up a bit, but if there's any more questions, if anyone would like to shoot through a question, we've probably got about 5 minutes left, Nick. It's just a fascinating book in so many ways. You open my eyes to so many things. Did you have, how did you sort of manage the research when you're actually pursuing so many different lines?
Yeah, and I think part of picking individuals, as I did, to kind of be carriers of the story actually helped me in some ways, because I could kind of follow them and it kind of invited decisions about what to include and what to leave out. But even during the research process, I found out stuff that I just thought, oh, that has to go in. That's, it's like the instance of Tasmania not being on the official Australian Olympic material, for the athletes, the jacket,
the uniform, the insignia.
Yeah.
Because apparently you then have to include Norfolk Island and Flinders Island,
and Heard Island, and all of that,
as if they were states. But Tasmania is a state.
Yeah, I know, it was extraordinary. So there were things like that. There was something we haven't mentioned, but I think is also kind of feeds in, which I found during the course of the research, was the censorship debate around Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
Yeah, so that was it had already been out in Australia for several years. A box of books, including it, is sent from the US to a young man in regional Victoria, and before it can get to him, the censor goes, "I'll be having that, because that's just not the kind of book that should be in this country."
But what was so interesting was that they picked up on Catcher in the Rye very late, and only sort of in that individual case, but they were busy arresting people for dancing the streets after seeing Rock Around the Clock.
I know.
Such an interesting sort of thing. But then I think, the whole church and state, people were going to church in the 1950s, very much more than they are now.
That's true.
So it must have had its influences, and the voices, the clerical voices were a lot louder.
But the other the other thing that was occurring was Kinsey's report into male and female sexual behaviour had been released in Australia. Not banned at all. And, arguably they are probably, certainly more graphic than the language and the intent of Catcher in the Rye. So, there's kind of interesting contradictions all the way through.
Well, it's actually in many ways a book of contradictions, but it does give an interesting picture, I think, of the Australian spirit and the fact that we are a friendly people. I think this is something that did strike the visitors, the people who came to the Olympics. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think the other thing that struck me was the resourcefulness. I think, there is an incredible capacity to go, here's a problem, how do we fix it? And I think it becomes more stark when you look at it, knowing what tools we have at our disposal now, and look back at it just for 60 years and go, I don't know how you worked out how to take a torch 3,000 kilometres,
And particularly after they faced the problem of when the torch arrived in Darwin and they had the 3 planes,
yes.
the one with the backup torch and the escort plane, and then the tarmac collapsed, melted under the planes, and in the end only one of them could get away.
Yes. And thankfully, the torch itself was suspended within the plane by, what we would kind of look like, a set of hockey straps, basically.
Yes, I was thinking like a bungee cord. Was it a miner's lamp, I think? Is that right?
Yeah.
And they had the backup torch as well.
That's
and there's that wonderful story about the torch arriving on the steps of the Sydney Town Hall.
Yes, and so,
tell us about that.
An imposter who was actually a university student who ran up with what was basically something he'd made out of metal and a pair of old underpants which he'd set fire to, and handed this torch to the mayor, who initially thought it was the real thing.
And I think that is just a fantastic place to kind of leave the discussion. But because in many ways it does exemplify that Australian spirit of, wanting to sort of have a bit of fun, be a bit of a larrikin, I suppose, that larrikin spirit,
Right.
But no, look, you've pulled so many interesting threads, political, social, cultural threads together. And you've certainly opened my eyes to a lot of things, and you sent me off, down various rabbit holes looking for information, which I thought was really great. So it's a terrific springboard to, more research and to understanding more about Australia, and particularly a lot of the political side of things, both state and federal. I thought that was really, 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 really well done. So congratulations.
Thank you, Jen.
And so thank you, Nick, for a terrific discussion.
Thank you.
So copies of 1956, even though it's a little backwards there, are available to borrow from the Geelong Regional Library's website in ebook format. And of course, many bookstores are still trading, and hopefully with an easing of restrictions in time, you'll be able to go in physically, but you can certainly order 1956, the year Australia welcomed the world, online. And there are lots of places that have reduced postage fees and free local delivery. So do take advantage of that to get Nick's book. Also check out the library's Facebook page for more upcoming events. They've got some terrific virtual events. And next Wednesday night, we have Tom Keneally talking about the Dickens Boy, his new book. So that'll be pretty cool too. So
I might tune into that one.
I certainly will. And visit www.grlc.vic.gov.au/virtual events for more details. Easy to find. We're all good at Googling, so we just need to make sure that we follow up on all of that. And we have some applause from Alex, and a thank you from Phil and from Meryl. So thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you to Nick Richardson. On behalf of the library, good night.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Nick. Bye.
Bye.